especially with everything going on in the world right now with protests and everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Seems very timely.
Absolutely.
And, we got a bunch of sources here from you that we're going to be taking a look at.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right in, I guess.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So, I mean, just starting at the most basic level, like we all have some kind of general idea of what these terms mean.
Okay.
Like, what is free speech? What is hate speech?
Right.
But where does one end and the other begin?
Right.
Like, where's that line? And is it even clear?
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this whole thing so tricky, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's not so easy to just draw a line in the sand and say,
Right.
this is okay, this is not okay.
Totally.
And so, I think historically a lot of people have viewed free speech as this, like this cornerstone of a democracy.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's a way to ensure that, we can hold power accountable, we
yeah.
can share ideas freely, all this kind of stuff.
Totally.
But, the reality is words have power.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you start talking about hate speech, you're really talking about speech that can, incite violence against people or incite discrimination.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about like the classic example that always gets brought up is like yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the one that's always brought up.
Yeah, because in that situation, like, you're not just expressing an idea.
Right.
You're creating a dangerous situation.
Exactly. It's going to directly lead to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where, you start to see like, okay, maybe there are limitations
right
to this whole free speech thing, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like even defining it, like what is hate speech? Because, one person's offensive joke could be another person's, deeply hurtful attack.
Yeah.
So where's that line? Yeah, and I think context matters so much.
Right.
Like the same words spoken in two different situations by two different people could be perceived so differently.
Absolutely.
And then you layer on top of that, like different cultures, different legal systems, different historical experiences all shape how these terms are interpreted, and what's considered protected speech in one country could be completely illegal in another.
Totally. So, I mean, it seems like even just defining the terms, we're already in this like big gray area.
We're already in the weeds, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we've talked about defining it or the difficulty in defining it.
Right.
Let's talk about like consequences.
Okay.
We hear about the harm of hate speech all the time.
Yeah.
But I feel like that can be kind of an abstract thing.
It's vague, right?
Yeah, like what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
Like what's the actual impact on people?
So I think there's this tendency to kind of brush it off as, oh, it's just words.
Yeah.
Sticks and stones, right?
Right.
But the reality is, like, it's not just about hurt feelings.
Right.
There's a lot of research out there now that links exposure to hate speech to some pretty serious mental health consequences.
Like what kind of stuff?
So, things like increased anxiety, depression, even PTSD in groups that are targeted by hate speech.
Wow.
And it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you're constantly bombarded with messages that tell you you're less than or that you don't belong, that creates this kind of constant sense of threat. And that takes a toll.
Totally. And, one of the sources you sent mentioned this study that was published in the Journal of Communication.
Yeah.
And they found that there was this direct correlation between online hate speech and actual offline hate crimes.
Wow.
And they're saying it could increase hate crimes by like up to 20% in areas with high levels of online hate speech.
That's huge.
Yeah, pretty scary.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
And I'd imagine this also plays into the whole issue of race relations as well. If certain groups are constantly being targeted with, hateful language, I imagine that's going to either create or definitely reinforce divisions that are already there.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you can't talk about hate speech without talking about the ways in which it's used to, further marginalize and dehumanize groups that have historically faced discrimination.
Right.
It's not just about individual harm. It's about the ways in which it kind of erodes the fabric of society.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And, makes it even harder to address like the systemic inequalities that are already in place.
Yeah.
So it's all connected.
Yeah, it's all a big tangled mess.
It is.
Well, and speaking of tangled messes, let's talk about these protests that are happening.
Yeah.
Seems like, things are kind of reaching a boiling point.
For sure.
What's your read on the situation?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to understand that these protests are rarely ever about just one single issue. Right? Yeah. It's always a culmination of, lots of long-standing frustrations, often rooted in like systemic inequalities, like we were just talking about.
Right.
And hate speech can sometimes be the trigger.
Yeah.
It kind of sets things off.
Right.
But the underlying issues run much deeper.
And from what I've been reading about these protests, it seems like they're attracting people from all different sides of this debate.
Oh, yeah.
There's people there who are, defending free speech at all costs.
Right.
There's people who are saying, no, we need to be way more strict about, regulating hate speech.
Yeah.
And then there's everybody in between.
It's a whole spectrum.
Yeah. And it seems like that's just another illustration of how difficult this issue is.
Oh, yeah. It's a messy situation for sure.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the legal side of things.
Okay.
We talked earlier about how, what might be protected speech in one place could be illegal somewhere else.
Right.
What are we seeing globally in terms of like how hate speech is actually being dealt with legally?
Yeah. So, different countries are trying to navigate this in very different ways.
Right.
You look at Europe, for example, they tend to have much stricter laws than, say, the United States.
Yeah.
Germany, for example, has this thing called the Network Enforcement Act,
Yep.
which basically requires social media companies to remove hate speech within 24 hours.
Wow.
Or they face like these huge fines.
Really?
And this has been, super controversial.
I bet.
People saying it's censorship.
Yeah.
But then you look at the U.S. and, we have the First Amendment,
Right.
which, provides very strong protection for free speech, even when that speech is, offensive or hateful to other people.
So very different approaches.
Very different, yeah.
So, given how different all the legal stuff is,
Right.
is there any evidence that any particular approach actually works?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Some people argue that strict laws actually just drive hate speech underground.
Okay.
So it's harder to monitor, it's harder to address.
Right.
And they worry about those laws being misused to silence dissent.
Right.
Especially when it comes to like marginalized groups.
Right. So it's like a double-edged sword in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
So if laws aren't like a perfect solution, what are some of the alternatives?
Right.
I've heard about things like counter-speech initiatives.
Yeah.
Is that something that's actually effective?
So counter speech is really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's basically this idea that, the best way to combat hate speech is with more speech.
Okay.
But it's speech that, promotes tolerance, empathy, understanding.
Got it.
So it's not about censorship. It's
Yeah.
about kind of flooding the space with positive messages.
I like that. So it's like fighting fire with water instead of more fire.
Exactly. Yeah.
And do we know if that actually works?
Yeah, there's actually some promising research on this. For example, there was a study done by the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
They looked at the impact of a counter-speech campaign on Twitter.
Okay.
And they found that when users were exposed to these counter-speech messages, they were less likely to, engage with or spread the hateful content themselves.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's kind of like, you're changing the narrative.
Right.
You're putting something positive out there to kind of counteract the negative.
I like it.
And, beyond just responding to specific instances of hate speech, I think we also need to think about, fostering critical thinking skills in general.
Oh, yeah, like media literacy and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Helping people to recognize hateful rhetoric.
Right.
To question the information they're seeing online.
Right.
To develop the tools to kind of, reject those harmful narratives.
So basically, like, education is a big piece of this.
Education is huge.
Yeah.
I think that's really where, long-term change is going to come from.
Makes sense. So, okay, wow. This deep dive, we've covered a lot.
We have.
We talked about the difficulty of defining these terms in the first place. We talked about, the harm of hate speech, which, goes beyond just hurt feelings.
Right.
The complexities of all the legal stuff.
Yeah.
And then some potential solutions.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, where do we go from here?
Right. What does all of this mean for, like, the average person?
Yeah, like, what can I do about all this?
Right. Well, and I think that's the key, right, is remembering that this isn't just some abstract debate.
Right.
It's a conversation with real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, we all have a responsibility to be part of the solution.
So what does that look like?
I mean, it can be as simple as speaking up when you see hate speech happening, even if it's online. It can be about supporting organizations that are working to, combat discrimination and promote tolerance. And, just educating ourselves, staying informed, and being willing to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah, powerful stuff. Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
And for everybody listening, what do you think? How do we strike that balance between free speech and protecting people from the harms of hate speech? Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us.